the dusty streets of Fort Worth, Texas, where cattle drives and railroad money flowed like water in 1878, there stood a saloon that locals whispered about in hushed tones. The Copper Bell wasn't just another watering hole for cowboys and drifters. It was a place where desperate souls found miraculous cures for ailments that had plagued them for years. Headaches that had tormented women since childbirth vanished after a single visit. Consumption that had claimed entire families seemed to retreat like morning fog, and chronic pain that had crippled strong men away as if it had never existed. But on the night of October 15th, 1878, 12 people died violently within its walls during what witnesses described as a scene from hell itself. And the official explanation satisfied no one who truly knew what transpired in those blood-soaked hours. What the authorities never revealed, what the surviving witnesses were too terrified to speak about, and what the town's most prominent families paid handsomely to keep buried, was that Dr. Cornelius Weatherby had been serving his patrons far more than medicinal tonics. He had been conducting illegal human experiments funded by Eastern pharmaceutical companies who viewed frontier communities as perfect laboratories for testing compounds too dangerous to use on civilized populations. Before we continue with the story of the man who turned Fort Worth's most beloved establishment into a laboratory of human suffering, let me know in the comments below what state or city you're listening from. And don't forget to subscribe for more dark tales from America's forgotten past. The autumn of 1878 brought more than just the usual cattle herds to Fort Worth. It brought whispers of miracle cures and the kind of prosperity that made men willing to overlook almost anything, even when their neighbors began dying under circumstances that defied rational explanation. Fort Worth in 1878 was a city caught between two worlds, balanced precariously on the edge of civilization and the wild frontier that stretched endlessly toward the setting sun. The Civil War's wounds had barely begun to heal, leaving the community fractured between those who had supported the Confederacy and the growing number of northern investors who saw opportunity in Texas's vast cattle ranches and expanding railroad networks. The Reconstruction era had ended only 3 years earlier, but its effects lingered in the suspicious glances exchanged between old residents and newcomers, creating an atmosphere of distrust that made it easy for secrets to flourish in the shadows. Dr. Cornelius Weatherby arrived in Fort Worth during the spring of 1877. Stepping off the train from Dallas on a morning when the prairie wind carried the scent of wildflowers mixed with the ever-present dust that coated everything in this rapidly growing cattle town, he carried only a worn leather medical bag that bore the scars of battlefield surgery and a collection of letters of recommendation from military hospitals in Virginia, documents that spoke of his service as a Union Army surgeon, without specifying which battles he had witnessed or what horrors he had endured in the name of saving lives. Standing just over 6 feet tall with graying temples and pale blue eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them, Weatherby cut an imposing figure as he walked Fort Worth's muddy streets in his immaculate black frock coat. His hands, visitors would later notice, never seemed to stop trembling slightly, a condition he attributed to the strain of performing countless amputations under fire, though some who observed him closely suspected the tremor had other, more disturbing causes. The doctor's credentials were impressive enough for a frontier town desperate for qualified medical care. Local physician Dr. Marcus Gilland was overwhelmed by the needs of a rapidly growing population, and the arrival of a trained military surgeon seemed like a blessing to families who had watched loved ones die from ailments that might have been treatable with proper medical attention. Weatherby's references spoke of innovative treatments and experimental techniques that had saved lives when traditional medicine had failed. Exactly the kind of advanced knowledge that Fort Worth's ambitious residents believed their community deserved. Rather than establish a conventional medical practice, Weatherby made a decision that surprised many but delighted the town's business community. He purchased a substantial two-story building on Main Street directly across from the First National Bank and announced his intention to convert the ground floor into a saloon while maintaining his medical practice in the rooms above and behind the main establishment. He christened his establishment the Copper Bell, installing an actual ship's bell made of gleaming copper above the entrance, its clear tone audible throughout the business district whenever the wind caught it just right. The combination of medical practice and drinking establishment struck many as unusual, but Weatherby explained his reasoning with the kind of scientific logic that impressed Fort Worth's educated citizens. He argued that alcohol had legitimate medical applications when properly administered, and that the social atmosphere of a well-run saloon provided psychological benefits that aided in the healing process. Patients who might be reluctant to visit a sterile medical office would feel more comfortable in a warm, welcoming environment where they could discuss their ailments openly while enjoying refreshments that were themselves part of their treatment. The main floor of the Copper Bell featured a long mahogany bar imported from New Orleans at considerable expense, its polished surface reflecting the warm glow of brass fixtures that gleamed even in the uncertain light of oil lamps. The atmosphere was more refined than most frontier drinking establishments, with carpeted floors, wallpaper depicting pastoral scenes that reminded visitors of more civilized places, and furniture that would not have seemed out of place in a St. Louis hotel. But it was the back room, accessed through a heavy oak door marked private consultation, that set the Copper Bell apart from every other saloon between Dallas and El Paso. Behind that door, Weatherby had created what appeared to be a fully equipped medical facility that would have impressed physicians in major eastern cities. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with brown bottles containing tinctures, powders, and mysterious liquids that caught the lamplight like liquid amber. A large desk dominated one corner of the room, its surface perpetually covered with medical journals, correspondence written in several languages, and handwritten notes in Weatherby's precise script that documented symptoms, treatments, and outcomes with scientific thoroughness. The room's most distinctive feature was its smell, a complex mixture of medicinal herbs, pure grain alcohol, and something else, something sharp and chemical that visitors couldn't quite identify, but that seemed to linger in their clothing long after they had left the building. Some compared it to the odor that clung to battlefield hospitals, while others thought it resembled the smell of the chemical works that had recently begun operating in the industrial districts of northern cities. Weatherby's approach to medicine was unlike anything Fort Worth had ever experienced, combining traditional treatments with experimental techniques that he claimed to have learned from European physicians who were pushing the boundaries of medical science. He spent considerable time with each patient, asking detailed questions not only about their immediate symptoms, but about their family history, their daily habits, their emotional state, and their deepest fears about their health. He examined them with instruments that seemed more sophisticated than anything. Dr. Gilland possessed devices with gleaming metal surfaces and precisely calibrated measurements that looked more like scientific apparatus than medical tools, but it was his treatment method that truly set Weatherby apart and drew crowds of desperate people from communities throughout North Texas. Rather than prescribing bottles of medicine to be taken at home where he couldn't observe their effects or adjust dosages based on individual responses, Weatherby insisted that his patients consume their treatments immediately under his direct supervision in the main saloon area of the Copper Bell. He called these sessions therapeutic consultations, and they quickly became social events that attracted not only patients but curious onlookers eager to witness what many considered medical miracles. The treatments themselves consisted of specially prepared drinks that Weatherby mixed fresh for each patient using a complex process that involved multiple ingredients measured with scientific precision. These concoctions varied dramatically in appearance, from pale amber liquids that resembled fine whiskey to deep emerald mixtures that seemed to glow with their own inner light. and their effects on patients seemed nothing short of miraculous to observers who had never seen such rapid and dramatic improvements in human health. Martha Caldwell, a seamstress whose debilitating headaches had begun after her husband's death in a railway accident 6 months earlier, claimed that a single dose of what Weatherby called his neural tonic had eliminated her pain completely for the first time since her tragedy. Samuel Hutchkins, a successful cattleman whose arthritis had progressed to the point where he could barely mount his horse without assistance, reported that Weatherby's joint elixir had restored his mobile to levels he hadn't experienced in over a decade. Word of these miraculous cures spread with the speed that only good news can achieve in isolated frontier communities hungry for hope. Cowboys riding the cattle trails between Fort Worth and markets in Kansas began making special detours to visit the Copper Bell, seeking relief from injuries and ailments that had plagued them for years. Railroad workers whose backs had been broken by years of laying track in harsh conditions pulled their wages to afford Weatherby's treatments. Even some of Fort Worth's more prominent citizens, including the wife of bank president Theodore Bancroft and the mother of cattle baron Harrison Wade, became regular visitors to the establishment. The atmosphere at the Copper Bell during these therapeutic consultations was unlike anything else in Fort Worth's experience. Patients would arrive looking haggarded and desperate, their faces marked by years of chronic pain or illness. But within hours of consuming Weatherby's preparations, their entire demeanor would transform. They laughed louder and more freely than they had in years, spoke with enthusiasm about plans and dreams they had abandoned during their suffering, and seemed to possess an energy and confidence that bordered on euphoric. Regular patients began arriving even when they weren't, suffering from specific ailments, claiming they needed Weatherby's tonics for preventive care to maintain their newfound health and vitality. By the summer of 1878, the Copper Bell had become the most popular establishment in Fort Worth, drawing crowds that often spilled onto Main Street and created a carnival atmosphere that boosted business throughout the downtown district. Weatherby hired additional staff to manage the influx of customers, including an experienced bartender named Jonas Kurt, who had worked in saloons from San Antonio to Dallas, and two serving girls, Rebecca Howe and Eleanor Finch, both daughters of local farming families who saw employment at the Copper Bell as an opportunity to earn better wages than domestic work could provide, while observing fascinating medical procedures that drew visitors from across the region. But even as Weatherby's reputation for miraculous cures spread throughout Texas and beyond, some observant residents of Fort Worth began to notice troubling patterns that cast shadows over the doctor's apparent success. Patients who experienced dramatic initial improvements in their conditions often returned to the Copper Bell with increasing frequency, claiming that their symptoms would return with greater severity if they missed their regular treatments. Families reported that their loved ones had become secretive and irritable when away from the saloon, obsessing over their next appointment with Weatherby while neglecting responsibilities at home and work that had once been important to them. Dr. Marcus Gilliland, Fort Worth's established physician, who had initially welcomed Weatherby's arrival as a solution to his own overwhelming workload, began to observe symptoms among the Copper Bell's regular patients that disturbed him greatly. Several showed signs of physical dependence that he associated with L-Dynam addiction, but their symptoms were more severe and unpredictable than anything he had encountered in his years of treating patients who had become dependent on opium-based medications. When he attempted to examine some of these individuals and suggest alternative treatments, he found them uncharacteristically defensive and hostile, insisting that only Dr. Weatherby understood their conditions well enough to provide appropriate care. The first serious incident occurred during the heat of August 1878, when cattle driver Pete Garrison collapsed in the dusty street directly outside the Copper Bell after consuming what Weatherby had described as a pulmonary restorative designed to clear his lungs of dust accumulated during months on the trail. Witnesses described Garrison as convulsing violently, his eyes rolled back until only the whites were visible, foam streaming from his mouth as his body contorted in ways that seemed to defy human anatomy. He died before Dr. Gilland could reach the scene. And when the local constable questioned Weatherby about the incident, the doctor calmly produced a handwritten document claiming that Garrison had disclosed a pre-existing heart condition that made him unsuitable for any form of medical treatment. The explanation seemed plausible enough to satisfy official inquiry, but several witnesses noted that Garrison had seemed perfectly healthy moments before consuming Weatherby's preparation, and that the violent nature of his death bore no resemblance to typical heart failure. More disturbing was Weatherby's reaction to the tragedy. Rather than expressing sorrow or concern about losing a patient, he seemed primarily interested in examining Garrison's body and taking detailed notes about the progression of symptoms he had observed during the fatal episode. 2 weeks later, a second death shattered the illusion of safety that had surrounded the Copper Bell's miraculous treatments. Martha Caldwell, the seamstress who had been one of Weatherby's earliest and most enthusiastic success stories, was found dead in her small home after missing several scheduled appointments at the Saloon. Neighbors reported hearing her screaming throughout the previous night, claiming that spiders were crawling under her skin and begging for someone to help her remove the insects that no one else could see. When her body was discovered, she had clawed deep gouges into her arms and face in her desperate attempts to remove the imaginary parasites, and the expression frozen on her face suggested she had died in a state of absolute terror. The official cause of death was listed as nervous exhaustion, a diagnosis vague enough to avoid raising uncomfortable questions about what might have caused such extreme symptoms. But those who had seen Martha's body, including Dr. Gilland, knew that nervous exhaustion did not explain the severity of her self-inflicted injuries or the unmistakable signs that she had died in agony, fighting against hallucinations that had seemed completely real to her tortured mind. These tragic incidents created the first serious cracks in Dr. Weatherby's reputation among Fort Worth's more thoughtful citizens, but they were overshadowed by the continued enthusiasm of his surviving patients and the substantial economic benefits his establishment brought to the entire community. The Copper Bell employed local workers, purchased supplies from area merchants, and attracted visitors who spent money at hotels, restaurants, and shops throughout the town. Mayor William Crawford, whose own wife had become one of Weatherby's most devoted patients after finding relief from chronic insomnia that had plagued her for years, was particularly reluctant to allow investigation that might damage Fort Worth's growing reputation as a destination for those seeking advanced medical treatment. As autumn deepened and the cattle driving season began to wind down, the atmosphere at the Copper Bell grew increasingly intense and desperate. Regular patients seemed to require stronger doses of Weatherby's preparations to achieve the same effects they had experienced initially, and the doctor began experimenting with new formulations that he claimed would provide more lasting relief from their various ailments. It was during this period of escalating experimentation that Weatherby began receiving regular shipments from medical supply companies in Chicago, New York, and even overseas sources. Crates marked medical supplies and laboratory equipment that contained substances and apparatus unlike anything Fort Worth's residents had ever seen. October 15, 1878 began like any other evening at the Copper Bell, with the usual crowd of regulars settling into their familiar chairs in the warm glow of oil lamps casting dancing shadows across the mahogany bar. But by dawn of the following day, 12 people would be dead, their bodies scattered across the main room of Fort Worth's most beloved establishment, and the survivors would carry memories too terrible to speak aloud for the rest of their lives. The day had been unseasonably warm for mid-October, with temperatures reaching nearly 80 degrees and a humidity that made clothes stick to skin and tempers run shorter than usual. As evening approached, massive storm clouds began gathering on the western horizon, their dark mass promising the kind of violent thunderstorm that could turn Fort Worth's dusty streets into rivers of mud within minutes, while shaking buildings to their foundations with the fury of nature unleashed. Dr. Weatherby seemed unusually excited as he prepared for the evening's customers, his pale eyes bright with an intensity that several staff members would later describe as almost manic. Jonas Kert, the experienced bartender, noticed him making frequent trips between his consultation room and the main bar area, carrying wooden crates that he handled with extraordinary care, as if their contents were more precious than gold or more dangerous than dynamite. When Keepart offered to help move the heavy containers, Weatherby sharply declined his assistance, insisting that their contents were too delicate and important for anyone else to handle. "Tonight will be truly special," Weatherby told his staff as they prepared the main room for what promised to be one of their largest crowds ever. "I have developed a new formulation that promises to provide more complete and lasting relief than anything I have offered before. Our regular patients will finally be free from their dependence on daily treatments, able to return to their normal lives with their the permanently restored." Rebecca, how one of the serving girls later remembered, thinking that the doctor's pale eyes held an intensity she had never seen before, a mixture of scientific curiosity and something darker that made her instinctively step backward whenever he looked directly at her. Eleanina Finch, the other serving girl, noticed that Weatherby's hands trembled more violently than usual as he arranged his medical instruments behind the bar, and that he seemed to be talking to himself under his breath, muttering phrases in what sounded like Latin mixed with English words she couldn't quite understand. The first customers began arriving just after 6 o'clock as the storm clouds grew darker and more threatening, while the first distant rumbles of thunder began echoing across the prairie. Among the early arrivals were many of the Copper Bell's most devoted regular patients. Cattle Baron Harrison Wade, whose wife had become one of Weatherby's most enthusiastic supporters. Samuel Hutchkins, the arthritic cattleman whose restored mobility had made him a living advertisement for the doctor's treatments, and Martha Ellsworth, a banker's widow, who claimed that Weatherby's mysterious preparations had completely cured her of the consumption that had killed her husband and 2 of her children. By 7 o'clock, the saloon was more crowded than anyone could remember seeing it, filled wall to wall with people who had traveled from as far away as Dallas and Waco, hoping to experience Weatherby's latest medical breakthrough. Word had spread throughout North Texas that the doctor was offering a revolutionary new treatment, something that would provide permanent cures rather than temporary relief. And the anticipation in the crowded room was almost electric as lightning began to flash outside the windows. What made this evening particularly significant was the unusual composition of the crowd that had gathered at the Copper Bell. Rather than the typical mix of working cowboys, desperate invalids, and curious locals, tonight's gathering had attracted some of Fort Worth's most respectable and influential citizens. Mayor William Crawford sat at a corner table with railroad executive Thomas Benedict and prominent merchant James Fairfax, their presence lending an air of official approval to the proceedings. Even Dr. Marcus Gilland, Weatherby's professional rival, had decided to attend the evening's demonstration, claiming scientific curiosity about his colleagues' revolutionary methods. As the storm outside intensified, with wind howling around the building and rain beginning to drum against the windows, Dr. Weatherby began his evening's work with unusual ceremony and deliberation. Instead of preparing individual treatments for specific patients as was his established custom, he announced to the expectant crowd that his new formulation would be served to everyone present simultaneously, allowing the entire gathering to experience its remarkable benefits together as a community united in the pursuit of perfect health. He called this unprecedented approach community therapeutic intervention, claiming that the shared experience would actually enhance the treatment's effectiveness by creating what he termed sympathetic resonance between the patients. The scientific terminology impressed his audience, most of whom had little education in medical matters, but were eager to believe that they were witnessing cutting-edge advances in the healing arts. The doctor moved behind, his bar with practiced efficiency, but those watching closely noticed subtle differences in his preparation ritual that distinguished this evening from all previous therapeutic sessions. Rather than using the familiar brown bottles that had contained his previous formulations, Weatherby opened the wooden crates he had been handling so carefully throughout the day, revealing crystalline substances that gleamed like crushed diamonds when they caught the lamplight and powdered, compounds that produced sharp acid odor when exposed to the humid air. One substance in particular caught the attention of several observers, a crystalline powder that seemed to shift colors as it moved, appearing sometimes blue, sometimes green, sometimes an oily, iridescent shade that hurt the eyes to look at directly. When Weatherby added this material to his mixing vessel, it produced a faint hissing sound and released vapors that made several customers step backward instinctively, though none dared question the doctor's procedures. "Ladies and gentlemen," Weatherby announced as lightning illuminated the windows and thunder shook the building, "what you are about to experience represents the culmination of years of careful research and experimentation. This formulation combines traditional medicinal knowledge passed down through generations with the most advanced discoveries in pharmaceutical science, techniques that will soon revolutionize medical treatment throughout our great nation and perhaps the entire civilized world." The drinks he prepared looked dramatically different from any of his previous concoctions. Instead of the familiar amber and emerald tinctures that patients had come to expect, these new mixtures had an oily consistency and an unusual blue-green tint that seemed to shift and swirl even when the glasses remained perfectly still. The smell was sharper and more distinctly chemical than anything served previously at the Copper Bell, with an underlying sweetness that several customers later compared to the odor of fruit that had been left to rot in the sun. Several patrons hesitated when presented with their glasses, disturbed by the unusual appearance and strong chemical smell of the preparation. But Weatherby's reassuring presence, combined with the social pressure created by the crowded room and the infectious enthusiasm of his most devoted patients, encouraged even the most skeptical to participate in what was being presented as a historic medical breakthrough to health and prosperity. The Dr. claimed, raising his own glass in a toast that was enthusiastically echoed throughout the saloon. The voices of 60 people joining together in what would be the last normal moment many of them would ever experience. The effects of Weatherby's new formulation began almost immediately, but they were unlike anything anyone at the Copper Bell had experienced during previous therapeutic sessions. Within minutes of consuming the mysterious preparation, customers throughout the room began exhibiting behaviors that ranged from mildly amusing to deeply disturbing. Some broke into uncontrollable laughter, finding everything around them hilariously funny and laughing until tears streamed down their faces and they gasped for breath. Others became hypnotically fascinated by simple objects, the grain of the wooden tables, the movement of shadows cast by the oil lamps, their own hands as they turned them slowly in front of their faces. What had started as unusual but relatively harmless behavior quickly escalated into something far more sinister and frightening. Mayor Crawford began speaking rapidly about elaborate plans for Fort Worth's future, his words tumbling together in an increasingly incoherent stream of consciousness that jumped from topic to topic without any logical connection. His eyes had taken on a glassy, unfocused quality, and he seemed completely unaware that his audience was no longer listening to his rambling monologue. Cattle Baron Harrison Wade became convinced that the other customers in the saloon were plotting against him, whispering among themselves about schemes to steal his land and destroy his cattle operation. He began accusing random strangers of participating in elaborate conspiracies, his voice growing louder and more aggressive as his paranoid delusions became more complex and detailed. As the storm outside reached its peak intensity, with thunder rushing overhead and lightning turning the windows into sheets of brilliant white light, the situation inside the Copper Bell descended rapidly into chaos and horror. Samuel Hutchkins, the cattleman whose arthritis Weatherby had supposedly cured, suddenly became violently agitated, claiming that insects were crawling under his skin and through his hair. He began clawing frantically at his arms and face, leaving bloody scratches as he tried desperately to remove parasites that existed only in his poisoned mind. Martha Ellsworth, the banker's widow who had praised Weatherby's treatments for curing her consumption, started screaming that the walls of the saloon were closing in around her, despite the obvious fact that the Copper Bell's main room remained exactly the same size it had always been. She threw herself against the windows repeatedly, trying to escape from dangers that no one else could perceive, her screams of terror adding to the growing cacophony of madness that filled the once peaceful establishment. Dr. Gilland, who had consumed only a small amount of the preparation out of professional caution, tried desperately to maintain order and provide medical assistance to those most severely affected by whatever poison Weatherby had administered. But even his limited exposure to the experimental formulation had left him disoriented and struggling to think clearly. His medical training, compromised by chemicals that were attacking his ability to reason and make rational decisions. The thunder outside masked much of the chaos occurring within the saloon, but even the fury of the storm couldn't completely muffle the sounds of breaking glass, overturned furniture, and human screams of terror and rage as Fort Worth's most respectable citizens transformed into violent madmen. Several customers had become convinced that their fellow patrons were enemies or monsters, leading to physical confrontations that quickly turned deadly as rational thought gave way to chemically induced paranoia and aggression. Railroad executive Thomas Benedict. He grabbed a broken bottle from behind the bar and attacked merchant James Fairfax, screaming that Fairfax was trying to steal his thoughts and replace them with foreign ideas. The two men, who had been business associates and social acquaintances for years, struggled violently across the main room, crashing into tables and chairs as other customers fled in terror or cheered them on in their own chemically altered states of consciousness. Harrison Wade, the cattle baron, whose paranoid delusions had been growing stronger throughout the evening, managed to find some of Weatherby's medical instruments that had been left accessible behind the bar. Armed with a bone saw designed for surgical amputations, he began swinging the wicked blade at anyone who came within reach. Convinced that he was defending himself against a coordinated attack by rustlers and claim jumpers, his wild swings with the surgical tool struck several other customers, causing injuries that would prove fatal despite their completely accidental nature. The sight of blood seemed to trigger even more violence among the chemically affected crowd, as if the primitive parts of their brains had been awakened by Weatherby's experimental compounds and were now driving them to behaviors that civilized human beings would normally find abhorrent. Men who had never committed violent acts in their lives were attacking friends and strangers with bottles, chairs, and their bare hands, while women screamed and clawed at imaginary threats or threw themselves against solid walls in attempts to escape from hallucinated dangers. Jonas Cart, the experienced bartender who had seen his share of saloon fights during his years working in rough frontier establishments, later said that nothing in his experience had prepared him for the horror he witnessed that night. He had barricaded himself behind the bar along with serving Giles, Rebecca, Howe, and Eleanor Finch, watching in terror as Fort Worth's most respectable citizens transformed into homicidal maniacs who seemed capable of any atrocity. Martha Ellsworth's desperate attempts to escape through the windows had resulted in severe lacerations from broken glass, but she seemed completely unaware of her injuries and continued throwing herself against the walls with increasing desperation. her screams reaching a pitch that was barely recognizable as human. The blood streaming from her wounds only added to the nightmare atmosphere that had engulfed what had once been Fort Worth's most refined social establishment. Dr. Weatherby himself had disappeared early in the chaos, retreating to his consultation room and barricading the door behind him. When Jonas Caird had tried to reach the doctor for help in controlling the violence, he found the heavy oak door locked and could hear Weatherby inside, muttering to himself in what sounded like a mixture of scientific observations and occasional bursts of maniacal laughter that suggested the doctor might have been affected by his own experimental preparation. The worst of the violence lasted nearly 2 hours, though the distortion of time perception experienced by everyone in the building made accurate measurement impossible. As the storm began to subside and the first hints of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon, the chaos inside the Copper Bell gradually decreased. Not because the affected customers had recovered their sanity, but because most were no longer physically capable of continuing their violent actions. Some had collapsed into unconsciousness, their bodies finally succumbing to the toxic effects of whatever compounds they had consumed. Others had died from injuries inflicted during the fighting, their blood pooling on the once elegant carpeted floors of the establishment that had promised them health and healing. The survivors were largely catatonic, staring blankly at the carnage around them with eyes that seemed to look upon scenes from hell itself. When dawn finally broke, on October 16, 1878, the scene inside the Copper Bell resembled a battlefield more than a social establishment. 12 people lay dead among overturned furniture, broken glass, and pools of blood that had soaked into the expensive carpeting imported from New Orleans. 8 others had suffered severe physical injuries that would require weeks of medical care to heal. Though the psychological damage inflicted by their exposure to Weatherby's experimental compounds would prove to be permanent and untreatable. The official investigation began within hours of the discovery, led by Constable Robert Hayes and County Sheriff Daniel Murphy, both men who had dealt with violence before but had never encountered anything approaching the systematic horror they found within the walls of what had been Fort Worth's most respectable establishment. The weeks following the massacre transformed the Copper Bell from Fort Worth's most popular gathering place into a monument to community shame and collective denial. The building stood empty on Main Street, its windows boarded with rough planks and its doors secured with heavy chains, while the town struggled desperately to process what had occurred within its blood-stained walls and to construct a version of events that would allow normal life to continue. Dr. Cornelius Weatherby, officially cleared of any wrongdoing by the hastily concluded investigation, made no effort to reopen his business or resume his medical practice. Instead, he retreated to a small house on the outskirts of town, a modest dwelling that he had purchased months earlier, as if anticipating the need for a refuge away from public scrutiny. When concerned citizens approached him with offers of support or questions about his future plans, he responded with vague references to correspondence with medical institutions in the East and research opportunities that might require his departure from Texas. The survivors of that terrible night found their lives irrevocably changed in ways that no one could have anticipated or prepared for. Rather than recovering from their traumatic experience as time passed, many seemed to deteriorate mentally and physically with each passing week, as if the chemicals they had consumed continued to work their poison through their systems long after the initial exposure had ended. Samuel Hutchkins, the cattleman whose supposed cure for arthritis had made him one of Weatherby's most enthusiastic supporters, began experiencing violent seizures that would leave him unconscious for hours at a time. During these episodes, which occurred with increasing frequency, he would mutter incoherently about insects crawling under his skin and beg invisible tormentors for relief from suffering that no doctor could understand or treat. His wife, who had initially blamed his symptoms on the trauma of witnessing such violence, gradually realized that her husband's condition was deteriorating in ways that suggested permanent damage to his mind and nervous system. Martha Ellsworth, the banker's widow whose desperate attempts to escape through the windows had left her scarred and bloodied, never recovered her ability to distinguish between reality and the hallucinations that had been triggered by Weatherby's experimental compounds. She became convinced that the walls of her home were gradually moving inward, crushing her living space smaller each day, and she spent her waking hours obsessively measuring the dimensions of her rooms and recording imaginary changes in a notebook that filled with increasingly frantic scribblings. Mayor William Crawford, whose political career might have been expected to suffer from his involvement in such a scandalous incident, actually found his position strengthened by the community's overwhelming desire to put the massacre behind them and return to normal life. His visible injuries from that night, a broken arm and severe facial lacerations that would leave permanent scars, served as evidence that he too had been a victim rather than a willing participant in whatever had occurred at the Copper Bell. Crawford used his influence and political connections to discourage further investigation into the massacre, arguing that continued attention to the tragedy would only damage Fort Worth's reputation and discourage the investment and settlement that the community needed to continue growing and prospering. His position was supported by many of the town's business leaders who feared that detailed examination of the incident might reveal information that would make Fort Worth seem dangerous and unstable to potential investors. The families of the 12 victims struggled with grief that was complicated by their inability to understand or explain why their loved ones had died in such a horrible manner. How could they properly mourn people whose deaths seemed to serve no purpose and make no sense? The official explanation of illegal alcohol leading to temporary insanity satisfied virtually no one who had known the victims as responsible, temperate individuals with no history of violence or excessive drinking. Several families hired private investigators to examine the case independently, hoping to uncover information that the official investigation had missed or deliberately overlooked. But these efforts yielded no new evidence and eventually ceased, partly due to lack of concrete leads, but also because of subtle but persistent community pressure to allow the matter to rest undisturbed. Dr. Marcus Gilland found himself in an impossible professional position following the massacre. His medical training and scientific background told him that the behaviors he had witnessed could not possibly be explained by alcohol consumption alone, regardless of the quality or quantity involved. But his own limited exposure to Weatherby's experimental preparation had left significant gaps in his memory, making it impossible for him to provide definitive statements about what he had observed or experienced during those chaotic hours. When pressed by concerned families and community leaders for his professional medical opinion about the causes of the violence, Gilland could only acknowledge that something extraordinary and unprecedented had occurred, while admitting his complete inability to explain it in terms that any rational person could understand or accept. The staff members who had worked at the Copper Bell, bartender Jonas Keert and serving girls Rebecca Howe and Eleanor Finch, found themselves transformed into reluctant local celebrities whose accounts of the evening were eagerly sought by journalists, curiosity seekers, and investigators from across Texas and beyond. Their stories remained remarkably consistent in broad outline. Dr. Weatherby had prepared a special formulation using materials they had never seen before, and the customers had displayed behaviors that defied rational explanation or precedent. However, as the months passed and the intense scrutiny continued, even their memories began to shift and blur in ways that made their testimony less reliable and more problematic. Rebecca Howe started claiming that she couldn't clearly remember exactly what substances Weatherby had used in his final preparations, suggesting that the trauma of witnessing such violence had affected her ability to recall specific details with the precision that investigators required. Eleanor Finch developed a severe stutter that made giving detailed accounts of the evening difficult and emotionally painful, and she eventually refused to discuss the events altogether, claiming that constant questions about that night were preventing her from healing and moving forward with her life. Her family supported her decision and asked the community to respect her privacy and her need to forget the horrors she had witnessed. Jonas Kurt maintained the most detailed and consistent recollection of the evening's events, but his credibility was systematically undermined by his previous reputation as a heavy drinker and his obvious financial dependence on finding new employment in Fort Worth's hospitality industry. When he attempted to organize his memories into a comprehensive written account that might serve as a permanent record of what had truly occurred, powerful members of the business community made it clear that such efforts would not be welcomed and might seriously affect his future employment prospects in a town where reputation and social connections determined a man's ability to earn a living. During the winter of 1878 to 1879, disturbing patterns began emerging among the massacre survivors and their immediate family members that suggested the horror of that October night had left contamination extending far beyond those who had actually consumed Weatherby's experimental compounds. Several survivors reported experiencing vivid recurring nightmares that seemed to center around the Copper Bell and the events of October 15th. Dreams that were remarkably similar despite the dreamers having no contact with each other during their recovery periods. These nightmares typically featured Weatherby's pale blue eyes watching them from shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. The sensation of insects crawling under their skin in patterns that spelled out words they couldn't quite read, and the sound of the 12 victims screaming in harmony as walls closed in around them like the jaws of some enormous predator. The dreams were so vivid and emotionally intense that many survivors began avoiding sleep entirely, leading to physical deterioration that compounded their existing psychological trauma. More troubling were the physical symptoms that began appearing among people who had not even been present during the massacre, but who had close family connections to survivors or victims. Martha, Ellsworth's sister, who lived in Dallas and had not visited Fort Worth in over a year, suddenly developed skin conditions that resembled the scratching marks left by customers who had clawed at imaginary insects during the massacre. The woman had never heard detailed descriptions of the symptoms, yet her self-inflicted wounds followed patterns identical to those observed on the night of the violence. Samuel Hutchins's eldest son, who had been working cattle drives in Kansas during October and had only returned home weeks after his father's exposure to Weatherby's compounds, began experiencing episodes of memory loss, during which he would perform routine ranch work without any conscious recollection of his actions. These blackout periods would last for hours, and when he regained normal consciousness, he would find himself in locations miles from where his last clear memory had been formed, sometimes with evidence that he had been engaged in complex activities that required planning and decision-making. The medical community in Fort Worth found itself facing a crisis that challenged their fundamental understanding of how trauma and its effects could spread through families and communities. Dr. Gilliland consulted with colleagues in Dallas, Houston, and even as far away as New Orleans, describing the constellation of symptoms he was observing without revealing their connection to the massacre at the Copper Bell. The responses he received were uniformly puzzled. No known medical condition could account for the combination of physical and psychological symptoms that seemed to be spreading through Fort Worth like an invisible plague. As spring arrived in 1879, Fort Worth's business and political leaders made a concerted effort to restore the town's reputation and encourage new settlement and investment that would demonstrate the community's resilience and continued growth potential. The Copper Bell building was sold to a consortium of local investors who announced ambitious plans to convert the structure into a modern general store that would serve as a symbol of Fort Worth's commercial vitality and forward-looking attitude. The renovation work began with great fanfare and community support, with local newspapers publishing detailed articles about the project's progress and its significance for the town's economic recovery. Mayor Crawford personally participated in the groundbreaking ceremony, using a silver-plated shovel to turn the first spade full of earth, while photographers documented the historic moment for posterity. But the renovation efforts soon encountered unexpected obstacles that seemed to defy rational explanation. Workers reported feeling inexplicably nauseated and disoriented when entering certain areas of the building, particularly the former consultation room, where Weatherby had prepared his final deadly formulation. Several experienced craftsmen who had worked on construction projects throughout Texas quit the job after, claiming they could hear voices and footsteps in the empty building during their work. Sounds that seemed to come from rooms that contained no other people. The renovation was eventually completed after numerous delays and cost overruns. But the new general store struggled to attract customers who seemed instinctively reluctant to enter the building where so many had died violently. Even visitors to Fort Worth who knew nothing about the massacre's history reported feeling uncomfortable and anxious when they approached the former site of the Copper Bell, as if some residual contamination lingered in the very stones and timbers of the structure. During this same period, Dr. Weatherby's behavior became increasingly erratic and secretive in ways that concerned even neighbors who preferred to mind their own business. Residents living near his small house reported seeing him working in his garden during the dark hours before dawn, apparently burying items that he handled with extraordinary care and marking their locations with small stones arranged in patterns that seemed to follow some complex system of organization. Strange odor began emanating from Weatherby's property with increasing frequency. Sharp chemical smells mixed with the unmistakable stench of organic decay that made passing animals avoid the area entirely and caused neighbors' horses to refuse to graze in nearby fields. When concerned citizens approached local authorities about the disturbing smells and Weatherby's suspicious nocturnal activities, they were told that the doctor was conducting legitimate scientific research that required privacy and discretion. The doctor's correspondence with Eastern medical institutions and pharmaceutical companies intensified dramatically during this period, with packages arriving weekly at the Fort Worth Railroad Depot addressed to him under various names and aliases. Railway workers who handled these shipments noticed that they often contained materials similar to those that had arrived in the month preceding the massacre. Crystalline substances that gleamed with unnatural colors, dried plant materials that produced sneezing fits in anyone who handled them carelessly, and chemical compounds that seemed to react violently when exposed to moisture or temperature changes. Several concerned citizens attempted to engage Dr. Weatherby in conversation about his future plans and his intentions regarding his continued residence in Fort Worth, hoping to determine whether the community might expect him to resume medical practice or relocate to pursue opportunities elsewhere. These encounters revealed a man whose mental state had deteriorated significantly since the massacre, though whether this deterioration was the result of guilt, chemical exposure, or some deeper psychological disturbance remained unclear. Weatherby spoke obsessively about his research and claimed repeatedly that the events at the Copper Bell had provided invaluable scientific data that would ultimately revolutionize medical treatment throughout the civilized world. He showed no remorse or acknowledgement of responsibility for the deaths and suffering that had resulted from his experimental treatments, instead describing the massacre as an unfortunate but necessary step in advancing human knowledge about pharmaceutical intervention in mental and physical ailments. When pressed directly about the 12 people who had died and the 8 others who had suffered permanent injury as a result of consuming his preparations, Weatherby's response was chillingly clinical and detached. He described the victims as having made voluntary contributions to scientific progress and suggested that their sacrifice would ultimately benefit thousands of future patients who would receive improved treatments based on the data gathered during that terrible night. His pale blue eyes held an intensity during these conversations that made even the most determined questioners uncomfortable, and his hands trembled more violently than ever as he spoke about the importance of his work and the necessity of continuing his research despite the temporary setback represented by the community's negative reaction to his methods. It became clear that Weatherby viewed himself not as a criminal or incompetent physician, but as a visionary scientist whose work was simply too advanced for conventional minds to appreciate. The winter of 1879 brought an unexpected visitor to Fort Worth who would fundamentally change the community's understanding of what had occurred at the Copper Bell and revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that had cost 12 lives and shattered dozens of others. Margaret Henley arrived on the morning train from Chicago on a bitter February day, carrying a worn leather satchel filled with documents, correspondence, and evidence that she had spent nearly a year gathering through painstaking investigation into her brother's death. Margaret was the older sister of James Fairfax, the prominent merchant who had died during the massacre when railroad executive Thomas Benedict attacked him with a broken bottle during the chemically induced violence. Unlike the other victims' families who had eventually accepted the official explanation and attempted to move forward with their lives, Margaret possessed both the professional skills and personal determination necessary to conduct a thorough independent investigation into the circumstances surrounding her brother's death. As a telegraph operator for Western Union in Chicago, Margaret had access to communication networks that extended across the entire country, allowing her to gather information that would have been impossible for local investigators to obtain. Her position also provided her with training in analyzing and organizing complex information, skills that proved invaluable in reconstructing the events leading up to the massacre and understanding their broader significance. Her investigation had begun with simple questions about her brother's character and personal habits that immediately revealed inconsistencies in the official explanation for his death. James had been a successful merchant with a well-established reputation for temperance and conservative behavior in all aspects of his personal and professional life. He rarely consumed alcohol under any circumstances and had never been involved in violent confrontations of any kind during his 38 years of life. The official explanation that James had died during a drunken brawl involving illegal liquor of unknown origin contradicted everything Margaret knew about her brother's personality, values, and established patterns of behavior. More significantly, it failed to account for his presence at the Copper Bell in the first place, since he had no history of seeking medical treatment for any chronic ailments and had never previously visited establishments that combined medical practice with alcohol service. Through persistent correspondence with various sources and careful analysis of shipping records, financial documents, and business communications, Margaret had gradually assembled a disturbing picture of Dr. Weatherby's activities in the months preceding the massacre. Her inquiries to medical supply companies in Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia had revealed that the doctor had been purchasing unusual substances in quantities that far exceeded what any legitimate medical practice could possibly require, even one serving a large and growing frontier community. These purchases included experimental compounds that were normally used only in laboratory research settings, industrial chemicals that had no recognized medical applications, and rare plant extracts that were typically employed in the manufacture of poisons rather than therapeutic preparations. The total cost of these materials over the 18 months preceding the massacre exceeded $15,000, a sum that represented more than most frontier doctors would earn during an entire decade of practice. More significantly, Margaret's investigation had uncovered evidence that Weatherby's relationship with pharmaceutical companies extended far beyond simple supply purchases, through contacts in the telegraph industry who were willing to share information about suspicious communication patterns. She had obtained copies of messages that revealed the doctor was providing detailed reports on patient reactions to experimental treatments, reports that were being purchased by Eastern companies for substantial sums of money. Hammond Chemical Works of New York and Brennan Medical Supplies of Chicago had been paying Weatherby consulting fees that totaled more than $3,000 during the year leading up to the massacre. Payments that were disguised as compensation for frontier medical research, but which were actually purchasing data about human responses to dangerous experimental compounds. The pharmaceutical companies were using frontier communities like Fort Worth as testing grounds for substances too dangerous to evaluate using conventional medical research methods in more civilized locations. Margaret's arrival in Fort Worth created immediate tension among the community leaders who had worked so diligently to put the massacre behind them and restore the town's reputation as a safe and prosperous place for investment and settlement. When she requested access to her brother's personal effects and copies of the official investigation files, she encountered a wall of bureaucratic resistance that seemed designed more to protect community secrets than to assist a grieving family member seeking closure and understanding. Mayor Crawford personally met with Margaret within hours of her arrival at the Grand Central Hotel, offering his sincere condolences for her loss, while suggesting that reopening painful memories from the previous year would serve no constructive purpose and might actually impede the healing process that the community was still undergoing. When she persisted in her inquiries and produced evidence that challenged the official explanation for her brother's death, Crawford arranged for her to meet with Sheriff Murphy, who provided a carefully edited version of the investigation report that omitted any mention of Weatherby's special preparations or the unusual symptoms reported by witnesses, but Margaret's professional experience analyzing complex information and her personal determination to understand her brother's death made it impossible for local authorities to satisfy her inquiries with incomplete or misleading information. She quickly realized that the officials were deliberately withholding crucial details about the massacre and were actively working to discourage her investigation rather than assist it. Her persistence and obvious competence made it impossible for community leaders to dismiss her as a hysterical woman overcome by grief, and her financial independence meant that she could not be easily bought off or intimidated into abandoning her inquiries and leaving town. The combination of her investigative skills, determination, and resources made her a genuine threat to the conspiracy of silence that had been constructed around the true causes of the massacre. Dr. Marcus Gilland found himself in a particularly difficult and ethically challenging position when Margaret requested his professional medical opinion about the circumstances of her brother's death and the official explanation for the violence that had claimed 12 lives. As the only qualified medical professional who had witnessed the massacre and survived with his mental faculties largely intact, his assessment carried weight that could either support or completely undermine the official version of events. During their private meeting in Gillen's office, Margaret presented him with documentary evidence that fundamentally challenged his assumptions about what had occurred on the night of October the 15th. She showed him copies of Weatherby's pharmaceutical orders, shipping manifests, and payment records, pointing out that many of the substances the doctor had been purchasing could not possibly be used for any legitimate medical treatment and were in fact experimental compounds that would be highly toxic if consumed by human beings. "Doctor," Margaret said, spreading the telegrams and financial documents across Gillen's desk with methodical precision. "My brother was not a violent man, and he certainly was not someone who would voluntarily consume illegal liquor or participate in the kind of brawl described in the official report. Something happened to him and the other victims that night, something that transformed them into people they had never been before and could never have chosen to become. I believe Dr. Weatherby used your community as a testing ground for experimental compounds that pharmaceutical companies wanted to evaluate using human subjects. Gilland found Margaret's evidence compelling and deeply disturbing, but also recognized that accepting his understanding of conclusions would have profound in the events and his professional responsibility to his patients and community. If her theory was correct, then he and the other survivors had been victims of deliberate poisoning rather than witnesses to a tragic accident, and the symptoms he continued to observe among survivors represented ongoing effects of chemical compounds rather than psychological trauma from witnessing violence. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Fort Worth intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The implications of Margaret's discoveries extended far beyond Fort Worth and the specific tragedy that had occurred at the Copper Bell. If pharmaceutical companies were paying for human experimentation, data gathered from frontier communities, then similar incidents might be occurring in other locations across the American West, creating a network of illegal medical testing that was exploiting the isolation and limited oversight that characterized life on the expanding frontier. The confrontation that would determine the fate of Dr. Weatherby's conspiracy came sooner than Margaret or Dr. Gilland had anticipated. On the morning of March 10, 1880, exactly 18 months after the massacre, Elena Finch arrived at Margaret's hotel room with information that revealed the doctor was planning to conduct another major experiment. This time targeting the annual Cattlemen's Association gathering scheduled for the following week. Eleanor had been approached by one of Weatherby's new assistants. Young men who had recently arrived in Fort Worth claiming to be medical students seeking practical experience and offered substantial payment to resume her position serving drinks at a special event. The instructions she received included precise timing and serving procedures that made it clear the gathering was intended to be another systematic test of experimental compounds on unsuspecting subjects. Margaret and Dr. Gilland realized they had less than a week to prevent what could be an even larger tragedy than the original massacre. The Cattlemen's Gathering would bring together more than 50 of Texas's most influential ranchers and business leaders representing millions of dollars in economic power and political influence. If Weatherby succeeded in his planned experiment, the effects could extend far beyond Fort Worth to influence decisions affecting the entire state's development. Their investigation had revealed that Weatherby was not working alone but was part of a network of researchers funded by Eastern pharmaceutical companies to test dangerous compounds on frontier populations. The doctor's correspondence, which Margaret had managed to intercept through her telegraph contacts, revealed plans to expand the testing program to other states based on the results of the upcoming Cattlemen's experiment. The final confrontation occurred on the evening of March 15th when Margaret and Dr. Gilland attempted to warn the cattlemen about Weatherby's plans and expose the conspiracy that had already cost so many lives. Their effort was partially successful. Several potential victims were warned away from the gathering, but Weatherby had anticipated the possibility of interference and had prepared contingency plans. The doctor's final revelation was that he had been systematically poisoning Fort Worth's water supply for months, conducting a long-term experiment on the entire community's behavior and health. The symptoms that had appeared among survivors' families, the strange dreams and physical ailments that had spread through the population were all the result of ongoing exposure to experimental compounds that Weatherby had been introducing into the town's